네, 그러면 조금 전에 진행하지 못했던 세계 수요 많은 시장 분석 및 전망에 대한 주제 발표를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 다시 한번 브렛 펠트만 애널리스트님께 박수 부탁드립니다.
All right. Thank you again. Let's try this. Hey. Okay, so I'm here from Navigant Research, which is a market research firm focusing on different areas of the smart grid. Different people that focus on the renewable energy, the utilities side, which is where I am, transportation, and smart buildings. And so we put out reports, and we also do custom research projects for clients. So that's my little marketing overview for the company. So I'll go through some of the drivers and barriers for demand response, some of the technology trends, and then we'll look at some of the examples of market occurrences and business trends, and also finish with some of my market forecasts for demand response. So a lot of these drivers have already been discussed because they're similar to, it's all kind of the same thing with storage and distributed generation and demand response, a lot of the same drivers, so I won't go into too much detail, but just there's a couple technologies that are helping to incentivize demand response. The first one is the advanced metering infrastructure. So we saw some statistics on the amount of smart meters that have been installed around the world. So that gives you the capability to have better interval data, to be able to look at energy usage in real time, and also you can then have more accurate pricing for that utility data. So that all gives more opportunity for demand response. The second one is smart thermostats, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide, but that's another enabler for residential and small commercial demand response. A lot of different policies and market aspects that have been touched upon already. First one is renewable integration. So this is a chart. It's called the duck curve or the duck chart. Has anyone seen this before? It's from California, and maybe since we're in Asia, we can call it the Peking duck chart. But basically, it's showing the difference in the load curve as there's more solar energy on the system. So right now, there's still a little bit of a peak in the middle of the day, but as there's more solar installed on the grid, the usage during the peak will actually decrease, and then when the sun goes down in the evening, there'll be a very sharp ramp back up, and there'll be a need for more resources at that time. So that's when you need flexible resources like energy storage and demand response to fill in that big ramp. Dynamic pricing, it goes along with the smart meters. So once you can have more accurate and locational pricing for customers as opposed to just flat rates, then that gives them the incentive to shift their usage to off-peak instead of the on-peak periods, and we'll talk a little bit more about some examples there. Grid modernization is a term that's come about in the last few years, and it's basically the idea of really changing the utility business model so that the utility is just a operator of the system, the transmission and distribution lines, and then you have the ability for other third-party providers to come and offer all kinds of value-added services on top of that. So we'll also talk about that later on, but there are a number of states in the U.S. that are moving along that path. Grid resiliency has been talked a lot about here. You heard about Superstorm Sandy in the U.S., which really spurred a lot of interest in resiliency. So along with microgrids and storage, demand response can play a part in that aspect. Last thing that's also been talked about a lot is the environmental benefits. So specifically in the United States, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has recently come out with some regulations on carbon emissions from existing power plants, mostly from coal plants. And so this is going to put a lot more emphasis on alternatives, whether it's natural gas or nuclear or renewable energy, but also energy efficiency and smart grid and demand response. So these are all things that are pointing towards more demand response in the future. Some other opportunities, that there's different ways to promote DR. You know, you can mandate it, you can have more market-based solutions, but you can also do a lot with standards. So there's a few examples of different types of standards that are promoting demand response. The first one is open ADR, open automated demand response, which I know is Korea is very active with, and you can see by the number of countries by members by country, Japan has a lot and Korea has many as well, and so this is really going to help the international growth of demand response. In the U.S., where it started out, a lot of the utilities and the providers had to start with their own proprietary systems, but now it can really help the new programs that are being developed by building it off of existing standards. Another one is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, which is known as LEED, and this is a program from the U.S. Green Building Council, which gives credits or points for commercial buildings that put different types of environmental attributes in their design. And so this year, LEED has started to include credits for automated demand response capabilities. So if you can get a couple points for doing DR in your building, that can help you get to a LEED certification, which is a big incentive in the U.S. to get that LEED on your building. The last one is California Title 24. So this is the state building code in California, and this is also new this year that the building code has an automated DR requirement for all commercial buildings over 10,000 square feet. This is for new buildings or if you're retrofitting an existing building. So, you know, different states or countries or whatever jurisdiction puts together building codes can include this in the code to encourage people to implement more demand response. Looking internationally, just a couple of the same themes. So in Europe, they have the specific provision called 20-20-20, where they want to get 20% renewable energy and 20% energy efficiency by the year 2020. I think they might be easing up on it a little bit because of the economy, but it's still going to be a big driver with a lot of countries trying to phase out either coal and or nuclear power. And then in Asia, everyone's talked about Fukushima, and I read last week that the South Korean city of Samcheok recently voted to reject nuclear power there. I mean, it might still go forward, but it just shows that there is sentiment against new nuclear, so you will need alternatives to fill in. And then the bottom picture is in China, and I think everyone said that if China moves into a market, that pretty much makes it grow. So China has some small pilot programs with demand response, but we expect it to certainly boom in the next several years. There are some barriers that I want to discuss. The first one is winter demand response. In the U.S., this past winter, we experienced what was called the polar vortex, which is a very extremely elongated cold winter, and so it caused a lot of problems on the grid all across the country, from the Northeast, from New York down to the Southeast, to Texas, to California. Really everywhere had problems with natural gas supply. That's the main issue, because in the winter the natural gas goes to the heating, home heating and business heating before the generators can get it. So there wasn't enough natural gas for all the generators, and so typically demand response is considered a summer resource, but now utilities are thinking of it as more of an annual resource, and that can be a problem because a lot of the demand response is based on air conditioning load. So obviously there's not as much air conditioning usage in the winter, so you need to see how DR can play in the winter type of a program. Another thing is the solar penetration. So we talk on a macro level. If there's more solar, you might need more DR, but also just on a micro level for an individual house, if you install solar, then that lowers your peak load. So sometimes these different types of resources can compete if you're looking on an individual household or building level. Just some other quick barriers, and these apply to both the residential and the commercial and industrial sectors. So there's control concerns. People don't want a third party playing with their thermostat, or a commercial industrial building doesn't want an outside party having control over their processes or their usage. And there's also in the commercial space not a lot of what we call smart buildings out there. There's a lot of facilities still without building automation systems, so that makes it harder to apply demand response to those types of buildings. And of course, cost. It's not free to do this. It's not always as expensive as people might think, but the cost, upfront capital cost, can be a barrier to people undertaking demand response. So we'll talk about a couple technology trends on the residential side. First one here is the new types of thermostats. So we have a picture of Nest, but there are plenty of other manufacturers that are making smart thermostats, two-way communicating. So instead of the old utility demand response programs where the utility gave you a switch or a one-way thermostat and they controlled it, now there's more real-time feedback for the utility. They can call the demand response more granularly, and also it's creating a business model called bring your own thermostat or bring your own device. So the customer can go to their retail outlet, to their hardware store, and buy their own thermostat, whichever kind they prefer, and then they can sign up for the utilities program. So it's a much more customer-friendly model. And then it's not all about air conditioning. Water heating has a lot of potential for DR. There's not a lot of electric water heating in the U.S., but in some of the rural areas there is. And so there's a term called grid interactive water heating now, which can have the water heaters respond in a matter of seconds, so you can do the types of ancillary services and frequency regulation response with a water heater, because a water heater is basically just a large storage device. You can charge it up and heat up the water overnight, and then you have it available during the day to provide that energy. On the commercial side, for the most part, all of the demand response hardware and software that you see out there, you have to install some type of a communication and control device at the facility. But there's one example from Constellation Energy, which they call Virtuawatt Link, which actually uses no on-site hardware or software at all. It just sends signals to a customer's energy management system over APIs, application programming interfaces. And so that lowers the cost of DR deployment. And so you can get to a lot of smaller facilities, things like retail chains, grocery stores, pharmacies, just smaller facilities where it makes DR more cost effective than having to go out to each site and install some type of device. One other thing that I found in my research is there's a little bit of a battle between different types of networks for implementing demand response. Typically, if a utility has installed AMI, they want to use that system to do the DR from a business case. But there are some drawbacks to using the AMI for demand response. And so there are alternatives like broadband, things like Wi-Fi or cellular networks, which have benefits. But there's no one solution that I'd say is superior. So, the speed, Wi-Fi can have higher speed, but AMI has better network availability, and there's some different attributes that you need to weigh this against. So it's going to vary depending on the case, but it's just something to consider what might be best for the particular situation. So just some trends that we see in the marketplace, and this first one is just saying that the markets in the demand response markets in the U.S. have really matured. They've been around for 10 plus years, and so the first few years, the rules were pretty easy. They were pretty lax for demand response participation in the markets. There wasn't that much of it, but as it's grown over time, the generators have taken more concern because it's taking money away from them. The regulators have figured out what types of rules need to be in place for baselines and penalties, so the rules have gotten stricter, which is you would expect in a maturing market, but there's the DR in some of these markets, like PJM is the biggest wholesale market in the world. It has the biggest demand response market in the world, and you can actually see a point where it's peaked a couple of years ago, and now it's starting to decline because the rules are getting tougher. So for countries or utilities that are starting new programs, you can try to learn from the experience in the U.S. and you don't have to start from scratch and try to go through the same learning curve. You can try to see what the best starting point is with the types of rules and regulations, so that you don't have that dip as you start your programs. The second one is on dynamic pricing, which is starting to proliferate more around the United States. So this is an example of SMUD, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District in California. They did a pilot for time of use pricing. They have a lot of different structures. There's critical peak pricing, time of use, peak time rebates. And so they actually found that customers were more satisfied with dynamic prices as opposed to their flat rate, which you might think is counterintuitive, but I think people understand dynamic pricing from other parts of their life, whether it's buying gas or airline tickets. There are things where the prices fluctuate, so people understand that, and if they can correlate it to their usage, then they feel like they have more control. So it can be a myth that customers want just a simple flat rate. And there are other utilities. Baltimore Gas and Electric had a peak time rebate program this year for all customers with AMI, and the customers responded. They gave out almost $2 million in rebates back to customers. So there's proof that it does work. So one example of renewable integration, Hawaii is kind of at the vanguard of having to deal with this, because they already have so much renewable on the system, and they have some very big renewable portfolio standard goals also. So they've already had a pilot program for fast DR in the commercial sector with some buildings, and so they're looking for a 10-minute response. They use a demand response automation server to run this program, and so they've found that customers can respond in that amount of time, and this is the type of thing that you're going to be seeing more of, moving from Hawaii more to the mainland, to California and other places like in Europe that are dealing with a lot of renewable integration. And as far as business models, providers are moving away from the typical manual model to more of a software as a service model. So it's an example of Enernoc, who introduced a new service. Typically, they would go to utility and they would want to manage the whole program turnkey, but some utilities don't want to pay for all that now. So Enernoc can just provide their demand response manager software system to the utility, and then the utility handles a lot of the operation of it. So Enernoc has found that there are some utilities that would prefer to do it this way, so they keep control of the customer relationship. And so this is a new way that a lot of the demand response management systems are moving, more of a SaaS and a cloud-based model. This is going back to the grid modernization point. So New York has a proceeding called Reforming the Energy Vision. So basically they want to make the utility what they call a distribution service platform. So basically the utility will be like your smartphone, and then they want all third-party providers to put their applications on top of that. And so different providers can offer energy efficiency, demand response, renewable energy, different types of pricing to customers, so that it's not the utility managing everything. The utility is just operating the grid and then letting the competitive market and customer engagement really drive changes. So this is something New York has the most ambitious plan, but Massachusetts, California, Maryland, a number of states in the United States are moving in this direction. So now we'll just go over some of the market forecasts. So the first one here is on DR capacity, which is probably the easiest way to measure the growth. So right now there's about 30,000 megawatts, 30 gigawatts of demand response around the world, almost all of it in North America. And looking 10 years out, we see that getting up to about 200 gigawatts. So that's very significant growth, and you can see that Asia Pacific and Europe account for a lot of that growth. As we said, China, we expect the large industrial sector in China to get heavily involved in demand response over this time frame. So this is the current market share, over 80% North America, Europe about 10%, Asia Pacific 6%. But then looking 10 years out, it's really more even, and Asia Pacific is almost even with North America. Europe is in third, and then Latin America and Middle East are starting to develop it as well. So as far as compound annual growth rates, on an average for the whole on a global basis, it's about 23%. You can see the North America is the lowest at a little over 10%. Europe is over 30%, but Asia Pacific has the highest growth of almost 50% per year. Then you can also look at number of sites. So this is looking at households as well as commercial and industrial facilities. So right now, there's in the range of 7 million facilities, and we see it growing to over about 75 million facilities in 10 years. And so a lot of that is residential. It's going to be households, but that is still significant growth and expansion. From a revenue perspective, right now it's around $2 billion or so, and you can see we expect it to get up to about $12 billion looking out, and a lot of that will be in Asia Pacific, again focusing on the large industrial sector in this area. All right, so that's actually it. I'm glad it worked this time. So, 감사합니다.